Okay, so this is a rat brain flat map. And so it's basically what you would see of a rat's brain if you flattened it out, unrolled it, flattened it out, and then made it two-dimensional. And you can see here, so this is the hypothalamus. And you can see that it's made out of these different nuclei, that's what they're called, and they sort of correspond to those shapes that I showed you in the human hypothalamus earlier. And you see that there's different systems. There's the system for eating and drinking is outlined in green, and the reproductive system, there's two of them, and they're outlined in I think it's red. Is that right? Yeah, reproductive is red, and the defensive ones are in magenta. And so those are you could think about those as the three fundamental value systems of living creatures with complex nervous systems as far as the hypothalamus is concerned. And then given what I told you about the hypothalamus, which is you hardly need the rest of your brain at all as long as you have a hypothalamus, it's worth thinking that those are very fundamental to value per se. Now, you might think if you only need the damn hypothalamus, why bother with the rest of the brain at all? That's a very useful question, especially because most creatures don't have much of a brain. So, but it seems to be something like, well, you've got your eating and drinking system, your reproductive system, and your defensive system, but the problem is that those things, first of all, can conflict. You know, are you too hungry to sleep or too sleepy to eat? So that's a pretty simple kind of contradiction, you know. Are you more angry at your partner, or do you want sexual relations more? So so they can conflict in the present, but then they can conflict with other people doing the same thing, and they can conflict across time. And so partly the reason that you need the rest of your brain is to solve the problems that emerge from the solutions that the hypothalamus offers. And so because you don't want to just eat and drink and reproduce and defend yourself, you want to eat now, later, tomorrow, next week, and next month, while you're able to engage in reproductive activity and defend yourself in multiple contexts with a whole bunch of people for as long as you can possibly manage it. And so you need the rest of your brain to calculate that. And so what the rest of your brain has to do, roughly speaking, is regulate these and also elaborate them up into like into something that's integrated inside you, which might roughly be your personality, and then so that that personality is integrated with the personality of other people. And so you can think about it as an emergent process. This is one of the things I really like about Piaget. He's so damn smart, because Piaget is the only thinker I know, really, who really addressed the problem of the evolution of value systems. Like, he never nailed it down to the physiology, because there wasn't enough known about physiology when he did his work. But it maps really nicely onto the physiology. But, you know, he said, well, but he got it right anyways. He said, you come into the world with a handful of pre-established reflexes. Okay, we're going to complicate that up a bit. No, you come into the world with a handful of micro-personalities that are centered around these fundamental motivational axes. Okay, and then that gets you started. And that has motor output as well as perceptions and all of that that's associated with it. And then as you interact initially, let's say with your mother, you start to learn how to integrate those things in some sort of social context, because you form a relationship with your mother right off the bat. And so you're starting to figure out how to produce patterned and stable interactions between those motivational systems on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. And one of the things you do with kids, it's really important to do this with kids, is you want to get them onto some sort of a routine. Because what the routine is actually is the beginnings of the system that integrates all of these underlying biological systems into some sort of unity. Because they have to sleep and wake up. So you want to nail that down so it's predictable. You know, they have to eat, they have to stay warm, and they need to do that in a manner that's stable. And so it's to your great benefit as a parent that you get islands of stability planted in the life of your kid, so that some of this gets simplified, so that the kid isn't constantly preoccupied with domination by these different motivational systems. And so it's a useful thing to know, because you might think, well, you don't want to impose any structure on your baby. It's like, no, wrong. You don't want to be a tyrant about it, but there's no difference between that structure and the emergence of the child's adaptation to the world. And to some degree what you're trying to do is free them up from arbitrary domination by these underlying motivational systems. You know, because if a baby gets too tired, it's a horrible little thing. It'll just scream at you non-stop, and it's not happy about it. It's like it's not good for anyone for that to happen. And so the faster, you have to do it in relationship with the child. You know, some will sleep right away in a schedule almost immediately, and other kids are harder to get their circadian rhythms regulated. So you have to attend to the individual differences that characterize the child, but you're still trying to establish some stable harmony out of this mishmash of initial systems. So, all right, so that's sort of a physiological look at it. This is more of a conceptual look at it. So I said that each of these systems you can think about in a bunch of different ways. You can think about it as something that sets a goal. I'm hungry and I don't want to be hungry. Point A, point B. So the hunger and the vision of the satiation of the hunger are all part of the same frame. And so if you're hungry, you go into the kitchen. You know that already. That's part of your procedural knowledge about how the world works. And then what you're going to look for are only those things that are relevant to what you're trying to do in the kitchen. Everything else is zeroed out. You won't even really see it. And why would you? You want to see the things that are relevant to the task at hand. And so that's the thing that's so cool, I think, because what it means is that you see the things that are relevant to the task at hand. And so here's something to think about. Let's say that you see a whole bunch of things in the world that you don't want to see, you know, that make you constantly miserable and unhappy. One thing you might ask yourself is, are you sure that your goals are proper? Because your goals determine what you see. Now, not 100%, obviously. You can be thinking about the homework you're going to do and step off a curb and be hit by a van. It's like you're going to get hit by the van regardless of how you've oriented your perceptions, likely, in all likelihood. So I'm not trying to argue for pure solipsism, but it is very interesting to consider that since you see in relationship to what you want, that a very large amount of what you see is dependent on what you're aiming at. And so one issue is, if your life is wretched and miserable, one thing to think about is whether or not what you're aiming at is the right thing to be aiming at. And nothing is exactly the wrong answer to that. I'm aiming at nothing. So okay, you're going to experience a tremendous amount of misery and not very much joy. So anyways, you've got this little frame. You're somewhere, and it's not good enough. And you're going somewhere else that's going to be better. And what better depends upon is the state of these underlying biological systems. And then more complexly, as those biological systems get integrated into a personality and into the social world, then the frame and the goal is going to be dependent on that more complex hierarchical organization. So you're not in here because you're hungry. You're in here because if you get a degree, maybe you don't ever have to be hungry. So the hunger is properly incorporated into your, you don't want to be cold, you don't want to freeze to death in the winter, you don't want to be on the street. You know, so your higher order goals are long-term, socially negotiated solutions to the problems that are implicit in your being. That might be one way of thinking about it. So and the micro elements of this, so you could say I'm hungry, that's a physiological state and a conception. I have a vision of how I'm going to solve that, but then, and that's an abstraction. But what you do to transform point A into point B is not an abstraction. You act. You know, so if you're hungry, you actually move your body, say down from the second floor into the kitchen, and you arrange things so that there's transformations in the world. And that's a good way of thinking about the relationship between the mind and the body. Your hypothetical solution to your problem, that's the mind. But the manner in which you incarnate that solution, that's no longer abstract. So, you know, people are always trying to solve the mind-body problem. And that's, as far as I can tell, that's how you solve it, is you have abstractions, but they're not abstractions that are representations of the world. They're abstractions that are representations of action patterns. And the way those are implemented in the world is that you act them. And so it's strange because you've got this weird level of control, you know. I can move my arm, and I seem to be able to do that voluntarily, but I really have no idea how I'm doing it. Like, I don't have conscious access exactly to the musculature, except technically, and I certainly have no idea what I'm doing chemically to make those muscles transform, but so my abstraction's ground out in this movement, and I can observe the movement and modify it, but I have no conscious access whatsoever to the microprocesses that are making that possible. I have no idea why that is. Probably because I'm not smart enough. That would be my guess, right? Is you're only going to, evolution is only going to allow your mind to control those elements of your being that you're smart enough to control. And so you don't get voluntary control over your heartbeat, for example, because you just forget, and then you'd be wandering around, and then you'd forget to beat your heart, and bang, you'd be dead. So you don't get to do that. So, all right, so all these different, I classified these again as self-propagation and self-maintenance motivations. And so if you're too hot, well, you want to go somewhere cooler, and if you're too cool, you want to go somewhere hotter. And same if you're thirsty and hungry. And for self-propagation, well, you get lonesome, and maybe you have some sexual desire, and each of those different systems competes for access to this central frame, and that's something like the contents of your consciousness at any given time. So up pops a desire, but it's the wrong way of thinking about it, because a desire sounds like something that's pushing you forward, but the desire is goal, framework, emotion, perception, action, pattern, all at the same time. It's a little personality, or it's a little story. Actually, when you describe the operation of one of these things, that's when you're telling a story. So I was somewhere, I needed something, I went and got it. It's a boring little story, but that's the basic unit of a story, right? Because I don't care to hear what you're doing unless you had a reason for doing it. So I just say, what's the point of the story? And the point of the story is the point. It's directional, right? It says, I went from here to there, that's the point. Here's how I did it, that's the point. And you're interested in that because maybe you want to know how to do it too. And you won't have to struggle through it like I did, you could just listen. And so we're always throwing these little units of information back and forth to each other. And for good reason. I want to know what your point is. Because better I learn it from you than make all the mistakes that you had to make when you were learning it. And human beings, we got that figured out, that's for sure.